Hello everybody, welcome to this episode of Tree Lady Talks. I really enjoyed this episode. Amanda is a publisher and editor, so it's always interesting to speak to somebody who is not a tree professional to get their take on trees. She went on this amazing journey tracking these huge trees in British Columbia. She met some great people on the way. Not everything went smoothly. When does it in life? I learnt a lot from her. I hope you enjoy it. Tree Lady Talk. Amanda, I've invited you here because I thoroughly enjoyed your book, which came out earlier this year, Tracking Giants.
And thanks for having me on, Sharon. So I am Amanda. I'm a writer and a book editor, and I've been editing books for about 15 years professionally. But this is my first book, so it's all pretty new and exciting. And I live in the Pacific Northwest of Canada, and I live on this small island, and I spend my days mostly reading and writing and wandering in the woods. So it's a very nice life.
Oh, it sounds idyllic. Absolutely idyllic. I think you've always loved nature, haven't you? Even as a young child.
Yeah, definitely. I was born in Ireland and spent the first 4 years there. And my earliest memory is sitting on a little garden wall and watching ladybirds wandering around. And I've always loved being in the garden or hiding in the bushes. It's a very solitary childhood, just, making up my own little dreams about forts and things and castles in the bushes. And that's carried me through my whole life. I just love being outside.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm looking here at the background, which listeners can't see, but you live in a really nice log cabin, don't you, in a beautiful setting?
It's about 50 years old, and it's just the best. I love being here.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
But you haven't always lived in the countryside, Amanda. You were working in a city.
That's right. Yeah. So, and my first 4 years of life, I was in the countryside, and then I grew up in the suburbs, and that is a very big part of who I am as well. But I left the suburbs and moved to Toronto, Canada's biggest city. And I lived there for 9 years, and I worked as an editor at Penguin Random House, which is the biggest publisher in the world. And I really loved that life for a really long time. And then gradually I grew tired of it and needed a change.
Well, don't we all sometimes? And so I wonder, what inspired you to, basically a desk-bound job? I'm a massive reader, by the way, so thank you for all the work that you do in that. But what inspired you to think, I'm going to start looking at giant trees? What led to that?
Yeah, so it was, living in Toronto, I did spend a lot of my days at my desk, and then a lot of evenings doing publishing events and reading manuscripts late into the night. But I also just like to bike around the city and tried to make the city my own. Toronto has its own outdoor settings, which are beautiful, but I never got over this homesickness for the West Coast, with all its really big trees and the crashing surf. And, once it's in you, it's in you. So I decided to quit my job at this big publishing house, and then I went freelance. And I thought, okay, now that I can work from anywhere, where do I want to be? I want to be back on the West Coast. So I moved across the country and settled into this new publishing job and freelancing on the West Coast. And that was great. But those big decisions to leave a job and leave behind your friends and move across the country are really taxing on you.
Yes.
Yeah, so I felt really, really burned out that whole winter, and I watched all of Downton Abbey, sitting on the couch.
Lovely. I hadn't watched Downton Abbey at all until the first lockdown. And Noel said to me, have you ever watched Downton Abbey? I said, no. He goes, why didn't you try one? That got us through that first sort of really scary pandemic time. It was like 2 a night. So,
it has that quality. So I hadn't seen it either, but I just sat there on the couch and watched it. And then that winter I got a terrible flu. And anyway, so the point of this, I just wasn't feeling like myself. I wasn't feeling in my body. But that spring, things started to shift again, and I started to get out more into the woods and hiking in our local mountains, which are the North Shore Mountains just outside of Vancouver. And I was really starting to feel like I was coming back to myself. And I mentioned to my friend Kate, oh, like I'm really loving all these day hikes, and I wonder if anyone would want to read a blog about some of these day hikes, and I can make them kind of literary. And my first year anniversary is coming up of being back on the coast, so maybe I'll launch this blog to celebrate. And she was like, that's like not really a great idea. No one wants to read that blog, but why don't you go see these champion trees? And I'd never heard of a champion tree, but she had read about the idea of big tree registries and champion trees in this book called Big Lonely Doug by Harley Rustad. And she said, go see the champion trees. And I looked it up, very quickly, and I saw that there are 43 big trees in BC, and I vowed to see all of them in a year.
Oh, that's an amazing ambition. And first of all, I love the way in the book you talk about your friends a lot. Mm-hmm. Friendship is really important to you. It is to me too. And you've got some great characters in there, and that was and your sister. So yes. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
But I also think that we don't, in this society now, we don't give enough credence to the fact that when we are making big life changes, we just expect ourselves to go on. And I've done that now. I've made this really positive decision in my life and I've moved on. And actually, it's really good sometimes to just allow our bodies to catch up with what we've planned to do. So you set out on this task. What did your friends and family think? So I'm going to go and see every big tree.
Well, I have this tendency to just jump into things. So when I moved to Toronto, I just moved there. I had a one-way ticket on the train and I moved there, and it was supposed to be for 3 months and it turned into 9 years, and I just kind of went with it. And so my friend Kate, I should say, also is a bona fide adventurer. Her name's Kate Harris, and she wrote a book called Lands of Lost Borders, which is about cycling the Silk Road from Istanbul to India. And we became friends through my work on that book. I edited it. It's such a hard word to say. And I say it a lot in my line of work. And because she had confidence in me to do this, like, no, you can see those trees. I thought, yeah, I could do this. And it'll just become a bigger, adventurous version of myself. But my friends just kind of were like, yeah, it sounds like something that you would do. And they kind of went along with it. But a friend recently said to me, she read the book, and we've been friends for years, and we're friends through the whole process of looking for trees and writing the book. And she came with me on a few trips. But she said to me recently, I didn't realize you were doing all of this whole time. Like, it was such a massive undertaking, and you really didn't present it like that. And my mom read the book when it was out in the world, and she said, if I'd known what you were up to, I would have put a stop to it. Far too dangerous, doing all this stuff on your own.
Well, actually, you did get a sense of that. So It starts off with you and your then partner sort of in this landscape with bushwhacking to get through and not being able to find the tree. And I have some sympathy with that. And actually, perhaps you could just describe the sort of general landscapes for those of us. It is an international podcast, but for those of us in the UK who haven't been to the West Coast, what is it like?
Yeah, so the scope of the project was interesting for me, and because I'm a West Coast person, and what the West Coast is like is really big trees, inlets, fjords, moss, ferns. This is like very green. It's a rainforest, and that was the setting I was really comfortable with. But I wanted to venture beyond just the West Coast and come to know my home province a bit better. And BC, British Columbia, is incredibly diverse biogeographically because it has 2 mountain ranges, and it has deserts, it has mountains, it has plateaus, like every type of terrain you can imagine. And some of those areas are quite treacherous. So the scene that opens the book, I'm hiking in the North Shore Mountains with my then partner. And the North Shore Mountains are about 20-minute drive from Vancouver. So they're deceptively close and they seem safe because they're so close, but they're very hazardous mountains, and people go missing in them and are killed in them every season. And this particular trail that I was on is closed for most of the year because of snow and ice conditions. So I tried to go see this tree about 3 times and had to turn away because of snow and ice, and then another time because of a bear in the area. But when I finally set out to do this, it was like straight up a mountain that I'm hiking, and this hillside had been logged. So it was very dry and not much greenery, nothing really to hold on to. Huge old stumps, lots of wind throw, lots of discarded logs that the forestry company hadn't taken in the 20s. And then when you get to the top of this mountain, it just levels out and there's this rich understory and all this old growth. And it's like being in a storybook.
Wow. So that
Yeah.
sense of wonder after the journey. And no, you describe it all really well in the book. And one of the things that made me chuckle, so I'm an arboriculturalist, so I do like to measure a trunk with my DBH. And your early trees, you're going, yeah, it looked quite big. I could just stretch my arms out and I haven't got my tape. And I think any arboriculturalist or foresters reading it were going, cringe, cringe. But you did eventually get a tape.
I did.
And you made a lot of new friends, didn't you? And tell us about some of the people that you met on the way and how they helped with the quest.
Yeah, so when I set out on this quest, I thought I'm going to do this the same way I do everything in my life because I'm a writer, I'm an editor. Those are pretty solitary occupations. And I started out by going to local parks around Vancouver where a lot of these big trees grow. And I did those by myself. And I found the trees and I thought, this is great early success. It's giving me confidence. And then I started to set out a bit farther afield and couldn't find the trees, and gradually realized that I needed to ask for help and let people in. And the BC Big Tree community is quite small, but it's very warm and knowledgeable. And the big tree trackers who had come before me were very generous with their time from the beginning, saying, like, let me show you how to find trees, how to measure trees, how to read a map so you can see where these dense pockets of old growth are. And once I kind of got over this idea I had of myself as a solitary striver and could let people in, I realized that they weren't just there to help me, but they were true friends. And that's when the possibilities for finding the trees and finding that community in the forest really established themselves.
Yes, it's so important to reach out to others. And I do find that anybody who works in trees, generally, we just want to support and help each other. And why do it all on your own? But it wasn't all successes, was it?
No, it was massive failures. It was more failures than successes. And for a long time, I really just beat myself up over it because I had this timeline. I'd given myself this task to find 43 trees in 52 weeks. And the idea of champion trees, so they're the largest of their species. And the reason that there were 43 is that there had just been 43 champion native trees put into the registry at that time. But of course, that number will wax and wane. And the number of champions in the registry kept increasing. And I thought, oh no, like stop it, everyone. Stop finding these trees because it's going to complicate my quest. And I remember sitting one weekend when I should have been out looking for trees, and I was sitting on my deck in Vancouver, and I was just thinking, oh, I'm just never going to finish this. I really suck. I'm not a good tree tracker. And I thought, well, maybe I'll extend the timeline to 18 months. Maybe that's the secret here. But of course it wasn't. And gradually I realized that the failure was as much a part of it as the successes. And my friend Ronnie said to me at one point, I've been reading your blog, but you haven't really been updating it for the past few months. Like, have you not been looking for trees? And I said, no, I'm out there every weekend. I just haven't found anything. And I keep going out to the same patch of woods and not finding the tree. And she said, that's actually what we're interested in. Like, we want to read about the failure as well.
This is really difficult to navigate and find the location of these large trees. But as you say, when you did get to them, they were in very poor condition. And I wonder, as you're your journey went on, if it changed your perception of what's the most important thing here. Is it the solitary big name tree, or is it the ecosystem around it? And what brought you the most joy
Yeah.
as the year went on?
So when I set out to find these trees, I had this idea for the blog, as I mentioned, but I also thought, these trees they're the biggest. They're some of the biggest in the world. They're so old. I was thinking specifically about the ones on the West Coast, which can be 1,000, 2,000 years old, and they're huge. So the Western hemlock that I found, when I didn't know how to measure it, so I timed myself walking around the base, how long it would take, and it took about 20 seconds, to walk around. And I thought, this is a huge tree. So I thought being in the presence of these trees would really be the answer. It would be the answer to all these questions I had in my late 30s and that had compelled me to move back to the coast and leave behind this really big, prestigious job. And that finding these trees and being in their presence would give me this feeling of transcendence. But I realized that, it's not about these big things that we go after, like that big job or even the idea of living on the coast or finding a mate. It was really about all the people that I meet along the way and all these critters and smaller trees that I was rushing past all the time to find this biggest and best version of something.
Yes, that's so true, isn't it? About life in general. We think the big stuff is going to make us happy, but actually it isn't always, is it? It's a nice cup of tea with a friend or a cuddle with your dog or something. Yeah. Something very, very simple. I mean, crikey, we're all guilty of that. I've certainly chased big things and achieved them. And then I thought, was that really all that?
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that either. Like I think it's good to set those big goals. Like, so I'm a new runner and I have this big goal for a distance I want to cover next year. And that's good because it'll get me out and running. But I want to make sure to, track the small runs and the people that I meet along the way. So you can do both.
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to the trees themselves, what kind of species were you finding? I mean, Western hemlock, what other ones?
Yeah, so Western hemlock, Western red cedar, coastal Douglas fir, ponderosa pine. These are some of the biggest and most popular trees in BC. Also Sitka spruce. The largest Sitka spruce were really logged out during the Second World War because they're very lightweight wood and great for airplanes. Fun fact about Sitka spruce. Also great for musical instruments. And those are the biggest ones. But the cool thing about the BC Big Tree Registry is that it's a registry of all the native trees. So there are much smaller varieties too, like Schuyler's willow and Pacific crabapple, and just all these smaller trees that you might not think of as big. One of my favorite trees in the registry is a Sitka alder. And some of the listeners might know of the Sitka alder and think, well, it's not a tree, it's a bush. And some people think it's a shrub, and some people think it's a tree. And that's another question is, what's a tree?
Yes, isn't it always? Yes.
Yeah. So I had this idea in my head from when I was little that a tree is taller than 3 feet. And if it's shorter than 3 feet, it's a shrub. I somehow just had that in my mind, and it's not necessarily accurate. But be that as it may, the Sitka alder is in the BC Big Tree Registry. It's considered a tree. And there was only one Sitka alder in the registry. So that was the champion. And I went to go find it with a friend who's finishing his PhD in forestry at the University of British Columbia. He's a former arborist. He really knows his trees. And we went and found the Sitka alder up at UBC. And it was tiny because it had been cut down maybe 12 years before and had regrown. And that's the thing about entering a tree into the registry. It doesn't protect the tree. It just is a record of the tree.
Yes.
And it was a tiny little thing.
Oh, you've made a really good point there. But before I ask you that, I mean, what are the sizes of some of these larger trees that are the champions?
So they can be, a tree that I found recently with a friend, and it's not a champion, but gives you a good sense, is a coastal Douglas fir that's 3 meters in diameter. and it was probably about 40 meters tall because its top had blown off. One of the most popular trees on the West Coast is this other Douglas fir called Big Lonely Doug, and it's 66 meters tall and 2 meters in diameter. But some of the cedars can get quite big. So a friend recently found what we think is one of the biggest cedars in Canada, and it's 6 meters in diameter.
Wow.
And over 2,000 years old. And as he said, it's healthy as can be. It could grow another 400 years. These trees just go on and on.
Well, we're going to take a short commercial break. I am so excited because the Arboricultural Association are starting up their Wednesday night webinars. I absolutely love these, not only for the content, but also for the fact it shows we have a worldwide community. You can see in the chat function that people are from all around the world, literally, saying hi to each other, sharing ideas. They are free. And the first one is on Wednesday, the 22nd of November, 2023, with Tree Lady Talk star Ted Green, MBE. They're at 6 p.m. GMT. The following week, on the 29th, is a farmer's guide to ash dieback. You can book these on trees.org.uk webinars. And it's hosted by the brilliant John Parker, the CEO of the Arb Association. But going back to the protection, could you explain about the protection? Because we have an ancient tree inventory here, which is not the biggest, it's the oldest. And those trees are not necessarily protected. And we have champion trees here in the UK. And again, they're not necessarily protected. We have other mechanisms for protecting trees. But I read in the book that there are different size thresholds, different organisations. Perhaps you could just talk about, shed some light on that, please.
Sure, yeah, I can speak kind of generally about it. So trees that grow in parks in BC are generally protected, and you can't just go into a park and cut down a tree. That is a problem in BC. There's quite a lot of timber poaching because the trees themselves are so valuable. So people do go into parks and other areas and cut down trees or hack off burls. And that's maybe another story.
Well, actually, I'll just interrupt you there because you referred to a wonderful book, Tree Thieves.
Yes, by Lindsay.
By Lindsay, and we interviewed her a year ago. Yeah. And that was absolutely fascinating. So listeners, do go back to that podcast on Tree Thieves because it's hugely complex socially, isn't it?
It is. It's very complicated. And so I'll just kind of skim the surface of it here.
Yeah.
But Tree Thieves is an absolutely wonderful book because it gets into the socioeconomic reasons for why timber poaching happens. But it's a real threat to trees in BC, and it's also cost the economy millions of dollars because BC is still very much a resource province, and the timber industry is one of our main resource industries. But going back to the protections, so yeah, being in a park protects it, and also it might be in a culturally sensitive area that's respected for First Nations. It might be, I mean, most of BC is unceded territory and it's all First Nations land, but some areas are protected under the law where trees can't be cut. And then this idea of thresholds is depending on the size of the tree, and it's usually the diameter of the tree and according to the species. So it depends on, a Western red cedar, it may be, and I don't have the figures to hand, but maybe it might be like something over 2 meters won't be cut. And a Douglas fir, maybe it's over 1 meter. And that's a good way to preserve some of our old growth and our biggest and oldest trees. The thresholds also usually have another rule about them in that you preserve that tree, but you also preserve the area of forest around the tree. So you're not just cutting straight up to the tree. But something that Sally Aitken at UBC, and she's a professor in the forestry department, and other people in the forestry world have pointed out is that the thresholds are kind of short-sighted because a tall, skinny tree let's say a Douglas fir that's growing in a ravine and shooting up for the light, it will one day become one of the biggest trees because it's very tall, but it needs that time to really girth out, and then it would be protected. But in the meantime, it's kind of fair game. You can cut down something because it's
Yes.
not big enough.
So if the threshold is too high, then we're not going to get succession, are we?
No.
Although you're keeping a hectare around the tree,
Yeah.
which is great, because the tendency might be, well, protect big lonely dog, but where are all its friends? And it's rather sad.
Yes.
And I say that in a childish way, but we do know that trees need each other to support each other.
They do.
And so, we can't destroy the habitat around it and treat it like a relic in a museum.
Exactly.
I wonder actually what you think about actually naming trees, the good and the bad of naming a tree.
Yeah, so the idea of naming trees is a practice that's really common among big tree trackers. And it's kind of fun because, you set out to find this tree and it almost becomes like it is another being, but someone that you know. And so you want to assign it a name. And that was something I realized early on in the project is I was looking at a spreadsheet of all the trees in the registry, and it would say like coastal Douglas fir. Maybe it would have the latitude and longitude of where it's located, maybe some directions to find it, and the sizes and the last time it was mentioned, and then a name like Big Lonely Doug or commonly Big Tree or Big Fir. Those are like common naming conventions. So you go out to find this giant tree that has a name like General Sansom or something like that. And it really puts a personality to the tree. And sometimes the trees' names are definitely in relation to how they look. So a very big tree that grows in the interior wet belt of BC and that's covered in moss and lichen is called Treebeard, like the Ent in the Lord of the Rings. And it's like, of course it's called Treebeard. It looks like Treebeard, that, as we'd imagine. But some people name the tree after their mom or their dog. And at first I didn't see anything wrong with this. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with it, but it's complicated because what I came to realize is that naming a tree also implies that you own the tree and that you have discovered the tree. And that tree, of course, is not yours to discover. And generally speaking, if a tree is very big and significant, the First Nations, the Indigenous peoples who've been living here since time immemorial, they probably already know about that tree. They might have a name for it. They might have an origin story attached to that tree. And to go in and just say, I'm calling this Steve.
Yes.
It's very colonial. And so I started to fall out of that practice of naming trees.
Very interesting. And everything is so nuanced. So I can see that it could be disrespectful. The other thing is if you name a tree and it becomes a thing that people might go and see, because I'm going to go and see Big Lonely Doug.
Yeah.
But ignore the beauty around me and trample through everything on the way. So I think if we just have these iconic trees which are named, it could perhaps be distracting from the wider narrative, which we need to protect our forests and our ecology.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it does raise the profile and it can be really helpful. Particularly, it can capture the public's imagination. Let's say that there's a fundraising needed or there's some cause, a tree can be a real focus for that. So it's very, very nuanced, isn't it?
It is.
I mean,
yeah. And I love that nuance because I think both things can be true. And the thing about Big Lonely Doug is it was left standing in this clear cut. And the story behind the tree is that the timber cruiser, so the forester whose job it is to go out into a block of trees and decide which one should be cut and which one should be spared, this timber cruiser put a ribbon around Big Lonely Doug and said, "Leave tree." And the story is that he liked the tree. He thought it was a kind of a perfect tree. He just liked it. And he said, "Don't cut this tree." There are other reasons that someone would leave a tree, like to become a seed tree to repopulate the cut block. So because Big Lonely Doug is such a perfect Douglas fir, it's a great candidate for repopulating that cut block. But when TJ Watt, who's a photographer and a local conservationist, when he saw Big Lonely Doug growing in that clear cut, he thought, here is an image for the environmental movement. And so both those things can be true. It can be both an asset to the forestry company and an icon for the environmental movement. And I was thinking recently about a book that was really influential for me in my late teens called The Legacy of Luna. And this is by Julia Butterfly Hill. And it's about her 2-year-long tree sit at the top of this redwood in Humboldt County in California. Oh. And that tree's name was Luna. And we can really warm to the idea of a tree named Luna rather than just a tree. So it helps us really care about these trees. And Robin Wall Kimmerer makes this point in Braiding Sweetgrass, where she talks about assigning pronouns to elements of nature. And she says, if you call a maple tree it's very easy to cut it down. But if you think of the maple tree as a grandmother tree, or you refer to her as she or him or them, then you don't want to cut your grandma down, generally.
I think that's really powerful, actually.
Yeah.
And so I do a similar thing. So often I work in planning and construction to do with trees and carry out initial tree surveys. And if there's a particularly interesting or special tree, then I will give the tree a name. Mm. And so it's quite an unusual thing to do on that situation. I'm not talking about a giant tree or anything particularly rare. And I found that to be really powerful. So the first effect it has is in a design team meeting with architects and engineers and clients and tree officers, it makes everybody laugh. So, you've named a tree. You've called it King Oak or King of the Woods or something like that. And then I make sure that it's on the map. Mm-hmm. And then everybody, suddenly it becomes, these are not just green blobs on a plan or a list of data. They are something more than that. And I found that to be a very powerful tool in protecting trees. And it's something that I talk about a lot, actually, and I rather hope it's catching on. So I think it has pros and cons. I think it mostly has pros, but it needs to be really sensitive to First Nations or local opinion. So that's really, really good. And the other thing you talk about is, which I thought was really good, was just the obsession with metrics. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that? And I'm with you, actually. Although I said, I wish you had your diameter tape at the beginning. Yeah. I think that we can become over-obsessed. What do you think?
It's really true. And when I started the project, I'm a word person. I make my living through words, and I have a bit of a phobia about math that I've been working hard to overcome. But I just don't feel comfortable with measuring and numbers. I didn't really see the point. I thought, isn't it enough for me to trek through the woods all day and find this tree? And it wasn't. The registry would rightly say, well, did you get the measurements? And I say, no.
Yeah.
I measured it. It's from, the tip of this finger to the freckle on the other arm. And that doesn't really help us. Or my partner at the time coined this idea of the Lewis qualitative assessment of bigness, where I could say that tree is big and that tree is less big. And this is thus our champion. And, that doesn't get you very far in science. And where measuring the trees really does matter, especially if you're talking about thresholds. And it can go a bit too far, I think. There's some friends of mine are just obsessed with where that measuring tape should go, especially on a cedar, which is very burly and might have a hemlock growing out of it. And it's like, how do you measure that tree? And I prefer to just sit back and kind of admire the tree. Like, I'll assist in the measuring and I'll hold the tape. But one of my friends, his name is Colin, and he's a musician and an artist, and he and I will measure the tree, but then we'll just sit back and he'll talk about, like, if I were to draw this tree right now, and like, if I were to write about this tree. And there's just different ways of engaging with something without constantly always measuring it and pitting it against the other one in the registry.
Yeah, I agree. It's not just that size that matters. It's everything around the tree.
Yes.
But Yes, but I suppose having that data
It
gets it in
helps.
there in the first place. Absolutely. So, did your perception of the value of trees as individuals change as you went through this process?
Hmm. Um, I think so. Yeah, I think before I had not really considered trees growing by themselves. I was interested in, of course, conserving forests, because I had this general idea that we didn't have much old growth left in BC, but I didn't have a number for it at the time. And then when I started shifting to this single-minded focus on individual trees, I became just obsessed with that. And then as I gradually got beyond that, then I could start to look at the whole forest again, but as a forest of individuals, like with every tree contributing something different and unique, and how this type of tree grows with this type of tree, and how we now know through science that they actually support each other and talk to each other, or how like a an alder is a nitrogen fixer and it's essential to the landscape, but you might look at an alder and be like, ah, it's like a weed tree. Why do we need so many of these alders? I want to get to the big trees, but it's all really essential. And a message that I really have with the book is that you don't need to be tromping around a forest to make it worthwhile, or looking for the biggest and best. It could just be a tree that you have a connection with, like you eat your lunch every day under a maple, or I think my spark tree was both a huge Douglas fir that I remember from my childhood, which towered over the street where I grew up. That's just because I live in the Pacific Northwest. Those trees are everywhere. But also, when I started the project, when I was in my late 30s, my spark tree was a Norway maple that grew out, or a silver maple that grew outside my apartment window. And I just started to really study this tree and think, huh, like who lives on this tree? What birds visit every day? When do the leaves change
Mm,
color? Like, what can I learn from this single tree?
wonderful. And in British Columbia, generally, how is the balance between timber extraction, aside from tree thieves, timber extraction and ecotourism? Is it shifting or are there
Yeah,
tensions there?
super big tensions. Yeah, it's BC's in this process of kind of reinventing itself and how it relates to trees. So a good example is this town called Port Renfrew, which is on the southwestern coast of Vancouver Island. And it's where some of the biggest trees in BC grow. They're just amazing. But Port Renfrew for a long time was a logging town. And gradually the logging, and I don't have the facts totally straight on this, but I think the mill closed or the logging shifted. Either way, there was a shift in it as a logging town to, I think, then fishing became like fishing and tourism became a focus, and now it's starting to reinvent itself as a big tree capital, because a lot of people go there to see Big Lonely Doug and see some of these really big trees. And so that's a tourism approach that's definitely taking off on Vancouver Island and in Stanley Park in Vancouver. But the overall industry in BC is at this kind of reckoning point, because a lot of the mills have closed down in the last 20 years, which is really, really tragic because it means that also the town dies, because the mill might have employed most of the people there. And there are all these
Mm,
ghost towns around BC where there's like a school and a playground, and there's just no one there because there's no one
yeah.
living and working there. But thankfully, that is changing slowly, and some of the mills are being retooled to accommodate smaller trees, the secondary growth, not just the old growth, and also making pellets, like for pellet stoves rather than just
Hmm.
um, timber. And a lot of our trees are exported overseas, and that might change. I'm not sure about that. But the big shift that was announced this week is the BC government has committed to really shifting how we deal with our trees and our conservation. And it's so new that I haven't wrapped my head around it yet, but they've made a
Okay.
huge investment in that. And so the conservation groups are really seeing this as a victory. And so it is slowly shifting. But I also need to say that I have no problem with forestry as an industry or logging.
No.
It's actually really essential. It's just that for the last 100 or so years, we've been doing it so well that we've logged out most of that old growth.
Yes, but with the increasing mechanization, it's just speeded everything up. Yes. No, absolutely. No, I agree with you entirely, actually. What did you make of us tree folk then? Because presumably until you started this, you perhaps didn't know many tree folk.
Yeah.
Are we weird?
Yeah, you're all like the brown wizard in the Lord of the Rings Hobbit. No, you're not weird. I mean, you're quite lovely. But I was definitely intimidated by arborists because they just knew so darn much. And I'd say, what is this tree? And they say, well, that's this tree, obviously. And I'd say, how do you know that? Like the leaves like of a London plane tree look so like the leaves of a maple tree. And I thought, how does one get all this knowledge? And of course, you get it by looking and asking questions and studying. But yeah, I was very intimidated by the big tree trekking community and people who would just go out and trek for days through these, like just bushwhacking to find this tree. And I thought, I want to be like that, but also like, what kind of person does that? Kind of scared of it. But of course, like once I got to know the tree trekking community, like they're so lovely and very generous with their knowledge. And I've come to know quite a bit about trees as well, without being an arborist. And it is just knowledge that's there for the taking. Like anyone can learn this stuff.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I got the impression that they made you very welcome and you had quite a good laugh.
Yeah, definitely. And they had a good laugh at my expense.
That's the best way, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So what's next for you?
What's next is I'm starting to work on a new book, which is not about trees. I kind of want to do anything but trees. And really starting to root down, no pun intended, but where I am. So I moved to this island in this log house about 2 years ago. And it was a really big decision, again, to move from the city to the country. I thought, is this going to, restrict my job options? And am I going to meet anyone? Like, where are the friends? But I've started to realize, like, it's like anything else. It is what it is. And I'm starting to love it for its own sake. So that's really what my days and my future look like, is working on a new book, building my business, and exploring these trails and these trees. And the trees on this island are much smaller than on the mainland, but they are really beautiful. Lots of barbudas.
Oh,
yeah.
It sounds absolutely idyllic.
Oh,
thank you, Amanda. It's
pleasure.
been really lovely to talk to you. So I highly recommend Tracking Giants because it's written in such a simple, engaging style, beautifully written, but you just go along with you on the journey. And it's very real. And I think that's great. It by no means is it a list of, I saw this tree and I got to it that way. It really is a very personal journey. So congratulations on the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.